Fed up with all the hype and spin surrounding last week's budget, still not entirely sure what the budget was supposed to deliver. Well, Agenda caught up with the Treasury Minister before his budget was debated in Tynwald to better understand what he hoped it will achieve and why it was formed in the way we eventually saw last Tuesday. This is what Douglas Central MHK and Treasury Minister Chris Thomas had to say before he had to react to public comment and modify some of his messages.
So the budget is carefully prepared, as it is every year, over months. Preparation starts after the last budget practically, and that theme is stability and security, and we'll come to that in a moment about a bit more what that means. So this is the budget that was prepared during 2025 for February Tynwald. I came in 3 weeks ago, and we've added a new byword to the budget title, confidence, and we've added in principally an increase greater 3 times what was previously intended in the personal tax allowance to build some confidence so that people can be more confident about their jobs and more confident about the number of hours they're going to have in those jobs if that's important to them, and also more confident to invest in the Isle of Man because we've got lots of reserves. The amount of reserves we've got are increasing, but we're having to use the interest on those reserves, and we're having to use some of the reserves for financing our expenditure on an annual basis. And that's not the Manx way. That's not my way. And what we're looking to do is we're looking to use those reserves to fill up the brownfields, to make sure that the schools and the harbours work better for people. The airports allows more reliable connectivity, and we need money for that, and so therefore confidence. And one of the important measures is allowing people to keep more money in their pockets.
And you talk there about stability and security being formally the two words, and then you've added confidence to it. I mean, it is fair to say that confidence was low, and I presume that was why the Chief Minister decided it was time for a new Treasury Minister.
I mean, it's part of it. It's part of it. The Chief Minister is proud of his period, quite rightly, 2017 to 2021, and he used successfully the raising of the personal tax allowance to stimulate activity, and he'll be explaining that in his budget speech. I've come along to do that with him. It's not only about the personal tax allowance as well. We've got new sources of tax revenue. For instance, we have the Pillar 2 tax revenue, which next year estimated to be 31 million, growing to 35 million, and that helps us to work with our more mature sectors like insurance. We've got new legislation.
And of course that's basically Pillar 2 means international bodies that are doing business on the Isle of Man are effectively paying tax.
That's it. Any organisation that's got more than 750 million euros has to pay its tax where it operates, and we've got a 15% domestic top-up tax. But I think you've nailed it, really. Confidence is about how you feel and how you behave as a consequence of how you feel. And I think we've begun to feel a bit sad about ourselves, and this budget is about giving us confidence again. And everybody nearly will be approaching £500 better off after a personal tax allowance rise of £2,250. If you were on the minimum wage, you would have got more by having the minimum wage increase, but that seemed unaffordable in so many sectors. So what happened in January was we slowed down the increase in the minimum wage. We cancelled a generalised support package that had been proposed, which would have taken the reserves down by even more than not collecting tax from people. And we're hoping that those in combination, and we expect, in fact, that in combination that will give people confidence and we can attract investment. Ultimately, a brownfield site is an opportunity because it's somewhere that can be filled with economic activity. Ultimately, the fact that that we need people to do the jobs and that people do seem to be moving here is an opportunity for us, and we've got to seize the day, seize the moment, and that's what this is, a budget of confidence.
And we'll come on to brownfield sites shortly, but the obviously the run-up to this budget has all been about the minimum wage. That's been the thing that everyone's been talking about, the gloom and despair. In many sectors of the Manx economy, it's all been about this minimum wage. Now, in Tynwald, it felt when the policy was, it wasn't reversed, but it was reduced from 9% to 5%, something like that. It felt like reassurances were being given that the increase in personal allowances would compensate for the lost income from the reduced minimum wage. That's not entirely the case, is it?
Well, in any economic situation, any social situation, there are all sorts of things that can happen. If you get a lower minimum wage per hour, but you're still in work, you're better off than hypothetically having had a higher minimum wage and not being in work. That's a really important point. If your hours are reduced so that you can stay in work and your hours are not now reduced, you're better off. If you're an entrepreneur, a small businessman running a business and you stay in business and can employ people, you're better off. And that's what it was all about. Nobody thinks it's right for people to earn less, but there are more people who need to make a living in their households. And by that I mean the self-employed, the entrepreneurs, the people who employ people. They need to have a fair income as well. So it was about rebalancing that, and we got it slightly wrong by having a minimum wage that was so much higher than that in England, and we got it wrong by such a large rise that we've slowed down that process. We were doubly wrong by thinking then of trying to target particular sectors with generalised expenditure of funds on particular projects. That really wasn't working, so that was the last straw, and that's why I came in, and I'm very pleased to be in government to try and rebuild confidence across the piece. And I'll say it again, that nearly everybody benefits from a personal tax allowance. It's not targeted just on people who would have been at the minimum wage, but although those people will benefit, the people who won't benefit are the tax cappers. Nothing's changed on the tax cap of this budget. They're still paying a huge amount of tax. The people who have their personal tax allowance taken away from them, the so-called tapered personal tax allowance group of people, and also people who are below the tax allowance won't benefit directly, but 3,600 people will actually be taken out of paying tax, which is again a huge number of people.
Last time personal allowances went up by an amount as significant as this, your boss, the Chief Minister, was the Treasury Minister. What impact did it have the following year? Because I imagine, and indeed I know you've said in the budget briefing to the media that you can't be certain about what impact this is going to have on tax take next year. What was the impact when it was done in the previous administration?
So the direct cost of every £250 of personal tax allowance rise can be £2.5 million. It depends on where you start from and a whole load of other factors, but it can be £2.5 million. So therefore, the immediate cost is to the amount of money that's coming into the public purse from your back pocket. But 1/3 of what we're proposing had already been budgeted, and with income tax rates growing and VAT rates growing with inflation in any case, another 1/3 of what the cost is already taken care of. So we ended up with a net financing impact of £10 million each year. So it's a sizable amount, but what we expect is that there will be economic activity stimulated and people will invest and people will have jobs and people will pay income tax and VAT as a consequence. So we expect multipliers, and that's what we saw in 2017, 2018, 2019.
Okay, so you mentioned brownfield sites. Now, it's not the first time a Treasury Minister has mentioned brownfield sites in this administration, let alone other administrations. What's different this time? What's going to make these brownfield sites, of which there are plenty across the island, what's going to make these actually get developed that's different in your budget?
So what I just told you in the briefing was that we've got £80 million of private investment expected around the 5 island infrastructure scheme projects that have been accepted, 2 of which people can see, Lake Road on the way to Douglas Tesco's and Villiers site opposite the sea terminal. 3 more, mostly in Douglas, but also one down in the south. I also mentioned the nurses' home project that's completed. That's what people can see already. What I said in the media briefing just now is that we've just launched a review of the use of that money, because it's proving incredibly expensive to support people to develop the brownfield sites because of construction costs, because of planning, because perhaps of the way we've organised that support. So that's now under review, and that's my budget ends with a section on beyond the budget, and one of my themes is about reviewing what the higher construction costs actually mean for developers and the viability of developments, and how we should perhaps refocus the way we approach these brownfield sites.
I mean, there are increases in most of the areas of government's expenditure, none so much though as the health department or Manx Care, which, I mean, it's 43% increase in its budget over 4 years. That's a huge amount. Well, presumably, we're all going to have perfect healthcare in the coming financial year, and there'll be no more overspend.
I'm not sure about perfection is something to be aspired to but never reached. But what I would say is it's going to be very hard to argue in future that the healthcare system is underfunded, because we're now financing healthcare at the post-Sir Jonathan Michael funding formula level, and it's increased by that huge amount, and it's still planned to increase. So therefore, the issue now comes about making choices about how we spend that money, and efficiencies and productivity in terms of how we spend that money. So we've tried very hard to restrain the healthcare expenditure, whilst recognising that we have a National Health Service, and most services are provided generously from the public purse. So you're right. One of the major risks that I identified to this budget, and indeed to public finances, is the healthcare system. We've got a governance review that's completed and that's been discussed in the same Tynwald as the budget. Treasury has abilities inside healthcare system that haven't really been used but could be used more. There comes a time when you have to accept that it's sufficiently funded, and then it's got to be properly delivered.
One of the obvious things that you would look to, were you hoping to either grow your business in the Isle of Man or indeed locate your business to the Isle of Man, is the infrastructure investment. Now, certainly in terms of the Department of Infrastructure's revenue budget, there's not a lot to be seen there by way of increases. Are we looking then at infrastructure improvements through capital expenditure?
To a small extent, but we also haven't got the highways projects that we used to have. So, every Treasury Minister 10 years ago was able to announce that they were going to build Peel Road or a promenade scheme or new Richmond scheme or something like that. They were also able to announce projects at the airport. No, we're prioritising maintenance. We do have some projects at the airport in the tower, and also in the passenger facilities, and also going on drainage. We do have some projects around the harbour, but very small amounts. We do have lots of minor capital works around all the structures and the highways and so on. But no, money is still constrained. Given the position that I've laid out very clearly in terms of reserves, we might have to look at alternative capital arrangements for some of our infrastructure projects, like we've begun doing with things like the new vessels in the stream packet. We've got the energy from waste lease coming to an end in 2028, needs to be refreshed. I've signalled to you private investment around the brownfield sites, but you've identified a real problem. We've got to make sure we're spending our capital, our 50 million more, even more preciously and carefully on the basic infrastructure, because that is what really matters. So, for instance, in our contingency reserve, we have identified a few million for air and sea service, air services projects particularly, and that's important to us because living on an island, getting off the island matters from time to time, or getting back to the island when you've been off, and we've recognised that in this budget.
So then, the thorny issue, of course, is reserves. At the last budget, we saw a wonderful graph which demonstrated that the financial year that we're in was going to be the highest spend, and then this year would be lower, and the year after would be lower, and so on and so forth. Your budget shows a pretty similar sort of thing, but with the exception that this year's budget, which according to last year's budget was supposed to be a lower use of reserves, there's actually a significantly higher use of reserves.
Well, that's not it's so complicated to explain the reserves position and the structural deficit position, because we've been, the last few years have been benign for reserves, because if you have money, you make money on the money, and we've been making a lot of money on the money we've had. So although we've been using interest and investment return from the reserves, and we've been spending the reserves to substitute for revenue, inadequate revenue, we've also had our reserves, total value of our reserves have been growing, particularly of the National Insurance Fund. So what you say is not complete picture, because the value of the reserves is still going up, and secondly, the amount that we've spent last year and in previous years has always been less than what's budgeted. But I can't pretend otherwise. This coming year, we're showing a greater use of reserves before we take into account investment returns than we did about this year, last year, and we're still expecting that if you exclude the national insurance investment returns, we'll be in balance again, not using reserves, by 2030, and if you do include the national insurance returns, by 2029. So it's still in the future, it's still after the election, but that's the position that we're showing now. But what I perceive...
But I suppose, sorry to interject there, but I suppose the obvious question is, with so many Treasury Ministers having said this in the past, why should we believe Chris Thomas?
Yeah, no, it is true, and it is very hard for politicians to rein in expenditure. But I've now joined the Operational Performance and Change Board, which had been a centralised government programme, but Treasury is now trying to link the efficiencies and the productivity gains they can get there directly to budgets. We have taken a greater role working with Manx Care and Healthcare, and last year, pretty soon after the budget, there was a call for funds to be drawn down from the contingency fund for healthcare. We're in a similar situation now. It's quite well known from management accounts that healthcare has been overspending in the last year, so I'm expecting a supplementary vote at some point for this last financial year. It is incredibly hard to be a politician. We have spent money by increasing the personal tax allowance, but I do think now there are systems in place. So, for instance, we have from Treasury, we have monthly scrutiny meetings now between the officers who work for Treasury in Treasury and the officers who work for Treasury who are embedded in the departments. I brought this to the public attention with my questions and repeated assertion of this in the House of Keys and Tynwald over the last few years. And the idea being to manage expectations. So I see that in the 75% of bids being successful, only 25% of bids were unsuccessful. And that's
but that's partly because this year departments were told stop bidding for silly things, only bid for things that are absolutely essential. So actually 25% of the absolutely essential stuff has been rejected.
So you can spin it like that if you want, but I can say the other way around. It's a working system that now there's realism on both sides. So departments understand the pressures that we're under, because Treasury's primary job is to raise enough public revenue and only enough public revenue to pay for only enough public services that we really need. So they understand our perspective now, and they're making realistic bids. And most of the bids that were rejected weren't rejected as such. They were just reduced in size. They were further paid. They were value engineered as a jargon. In terms of capital projects, a few years ago, we've moved over to this project management system. And I think people thought that once you were on the list to be in the project management system, you were financed, but that's not the case. That we have Castle Rushen High School, Queen Elizabeth II High School, Science and Technology Block, Henry Bloom Noble Extension, Murray's Road School Replacement, and that's just schools all inside that process. And only Henry Bloom Noble is actually already started and is already being financed. All of the rest of them are in the process of making sure that the design, the architects, the engineering is done up front. Look. What we've learned from a whole range of areas is that in the early 2 or 3 years of a project, you have to actually make correct decisions about the risk, and you have to know when you've started something wrong and walk away from it again. And that's what we try to do now in the project development process. We've got another project like that coming down the track, which is called the One Government Estate. So by the end of this parliamentary year, and it's something I've actually been working on a lot in the last couple of weeks, we expect to be using a transfer of functions order to transfer the ownership of much of property, whether it be Crown property or whether it be departmental property or whether it be people's property, into a place to be managed in an optimal way. Every right, every interest that's there, every covenant that's still there is unaffected. It's all preserved, but we hope to be optimising the use of the assets. So, for instance, in the most recent parliamentary sitting, a written question that I came across when I was sitting in the sitting recently was all about the Hills Meadow training facility, and that's a huge part of the public estate. And the idea is we're looking to use that better. So there's all sorts of things going on, digital, procurement, HR, that I do think now the public can believe that we are really focused on productivity, efficiency, and I hope that becomes clear to the public that Thomas was talking sense back in 2026 by 2031.
Well, let's hope so. The one bit that surprised me really was the only highlight, and we're I'm basing this question on what you chose to highlight, or your officers chose to highlight, which was, so I think it was about £3 million increase to the Department for Enterprise, primarily to cover money val related issues. Is DFE not looking for more money? I mean, presumably one way to solve your black hole in terms of government expenditure is to find more income.
Well, one of the funds that's grown in value in recent years is the seized asset fund, because we've had too much criminal activity on the Isle of Man, and we need to not be a place that you can get away with being a criminal. You clearly aren't, because they're losing their assets and they're getting them picked up. But money val is important for us. What the people who've worked in our very successful financial services, insurance, banking, new e-gaming sectors and so many other professional services more generally have said is that we need to have adequate regulation. We need to do it right so that we get business, and that will mean that we have VAT, income tax paid. We even have now this Pillar 2, which we're planning on getting 31 million for from these sorts of firms. I will be talking in my budget speech about reusing some of that Pillar 2 money to support some of these maturer sectors. So I'm optimistic about that. You don't actually have to spend a lot of money to make money, as long as you have the regulation right, and as we talked about earlier, the infrastructure right, and the lifestyle right, and the culture right, and the sport right. It's a good place to live, and we'll be in a position to get money.
And do you think we have got all these things right, particularly when it comes to regulation of business? Most times, I mean, maybe this is just anecdotal, but most times I speak to business, the general view is if you want to get a grant, you've got to dedicate a week of your time to fill the form in. Most of what you're filling in, the department that you're filling the form in for already knows about you, and the regulation is similarly overburdensome.
Fair comment. And across the board, particularly in Treasury, we are trying to modernise all those systems. So in the Social Security Division, they've got a project called an IT project to make it easier to fill in all of the forms. We have to have that for businesses. We've now got direct debit systems being rolled out. We've got conceivably we've got more generalised cards with cash on it to help across government. We have to get all of these systems right. We can't regulate for the sake of regulating. Regulation's got to be the necessary level of regulation. I spoke the way that you've just described people speaking in November, Tynwald, and in the second reading of the gambling regulation bill. I'm now Treasury Minister and was taken the gambling bill through the House of Keys. It was amended with my amendments, which Kate Lord-Brennan very kindly brought for me in the clauses stage. And I think we're in a better place. I've now attended meetings with lawyers and insurance people and bankers and the like, and they said, we do feel as if we have a shared vision of where we're going to be in 5 years, and it gives us confidence and hope. So that's another. I can't say there's a measure very much specifically for that in the budget, except perhaps for Pillar 2 usage. But it all goes hand in hand with rebuilding our confidence.
So are we? I mean, I described the Perspective programme last week as a little, the budget or the financial prospects for the Isle of Man being very much like recent weather forecasts, dark and gloomy, with a risk of budget overtopping in the health department. Is that a thing of the past now?
That definitely characterises the future. But one of my island heroes is Manannan, and Manannan, has blue skies and sunny weather. We're getting towards spring. Let's hope that Manannan welcomes this budget and we have blue skies and sunshine, and we move away to those 30 days of endless rain and misery that of January and early part of February have been.
And effectively, back to the budget then, stability, security and confidence. That's what you are hoping that this is going to deliver.
Yeah, and I started my speech along those lines, but also kept emphasising the fact that we need productivity and efficiency to make sure that we get that. And there are more beneficiaries than have come up so far in this interview. We've got 35 million from the Consolidated Loans Fund towards the Manx Utilities Authority to keep the gas turbines going until we get anywhere with alternative energy. We've got not the whole. So some of that 35 million is for that. Other parts of it is for the regional sewerage. Other parts of it is for wastewater. Other parts of it is for water. We've also got continuing work going on Caervai, Eristane wind farm, but that has to come back to Tynwald, and that whole project is a delicate one. So alternative energy is there in the budget, but so is basically keeping our electricity supply, our water systems stable and secure as well.
That was Treasury Minister Chris Thomas. So what do you think? Is this a cobbled together at the last minute, all things to all people pre-election giveaway? Is cutting taxes going to pay off with increased economic activity? Or is it just the last throw of a government which was big on talk but light on delivery? For now, I'm Phil Gaughan. Go to my house on Geistachrum. Thanks for listening.